Duvid here. We are live with Daniel from Active Inference. Very excited to have him on the channel. We are live. Sorry, with Daniel. Mute myself. So till it's live, it's working. And I've been, interested in the science of consciousness, consciousness interfaith. Anyone's been following my channel. One of the very first things I put on my channel was, in fact, interfaith. And as I mentioned, consciousness, various religious topics, but also I'm an engineer background in science. From my debates against evolution, the science of consciousness is the main topic of Week in Review with Jennifer. Maybe she'll be able to join us if it fits her schedule. And my multiple truth hypothesis, which I streamed many times, which has many layers to it, but I also would like it to have some sort of mathematical basis. So on Week in Review, I have shared Active Inference Lab for a few months ago because mostly Carl Friston. I wanted to find some videos of Carl Friston to learn more about the free energy principle and the predictive mind. And I came across Active Inference because I had Carl Friston interviews, and they had good PowerPoints and lectures. So I had been sharing it for a few months, and I started watching all of their videos, starting from video 1. And after about video 20, I decided to join the Discord. And then I joined the Discord, and I spoke with a few people. And Daniel is one of their moderators, and anyone who's watched their channel will be familiar with Daniel. So I reached out to him, and I was a guest on 2 of their panels the last 2 weeks. And so I'm very happy that Daniel agreed to talk to me. He's postdoc research in I think biology, entomology, studied ants, and he's currently the moderator at the Active Inference Lab. So I hand it over to Daniel to give a full biography, any information they think is relevant. If you want to start, from your early childhood and what caused you to wonder about the mystery of consciousness, or if you just want to give a professional, all that's interesting to my audience. My audience likes long evolutions of thought, and how you became interested in the idea and how it's progressed over time. So I bring you Daniel. Very excited to have him here.
Thanks a lot, David. This will be very fun. Looking forward to the conversation, and so many ways to begin or continue, as it were. I guess I'll give some recap of how I came to Active Inference, starting pretty far back. And then that will take us on a journey, a foraging trip that may veer off into entomology, insect research, consciousness, math, everything in between. I guess where it makes sense to at least pick up this chapter of the story is when I was in undergraduate, coming in to study biochemistry. I thought molecules were cool, bio's cool, science is cool. And one of the things that always motivated me when I was studying sometimes the sterile or reductionist aspects of biochemistry was thinking about it in the biological context, where a molecule's shape, whether we think of it as just ball and stick or something more energetic or even something more mystical, the shape of some molecule binds to some receptor, and ... fill in the dots, we have a different experience, whether that's changing some kind of state that we're in cognitively, mentally, or even having experiences that people think are spiritual. So I started on that path. And as I started learning about the shape of those molecules, it pulled me back to what provided the information for those molecules to have that shape. And that was genetics and evolutionary biology. So in undergraduate, I continued with genetics, and I studied developmental genetics in fruit flies, Drosophila, which is a model system that's used very commonly for a variety of scientific topics, but developmental biology is one that it's been used for a lot. So that was my also introduction to insects, because I kind of came into that system from the development and evolution and molecular angle, and I came out of that process really loving insects more and wanting to continue study of insects. So towards the end of undergraduate, when I was thinking about how I wanted to continue with science as a way of knowing the world and as a career and as a profession, I also was getting more interested in systems, complexity, collective behavior, emergent phenomena, stigmergy, which is collective systems that are engaged in a feedback loop with modifications of the environment, like the ant colony. And that's what brought me to go to graduate school from 2014 to 2019. And I studied with Professor Deborah Gordon at Stanford. She had a long history of doing behavioral ecology in ants and a very long-term field site in Southeast Arizona, where there was a population of harvester ants that had been under observation for many years. And this harvester ant species has some features that also make it really amenable to long-term study. For example, there's one queen, it's a single colony nest, and they rarely relocate. So it's possible to put a rock with a dog tag and mark colony 837 and come back to 837 next year and see how it's doing. Whereas ants that live in the leaf litter, for example, it's very hard to track them year after year. This system had been analyzed from a behavioral and an ecological perspective, and to some extent, a population genetic perspective. But I was very interested in studying things like gene expression and neurophysiology. And so I, over the years of graduate school, worked to learn from what had been done in fruit fly research, which is where many of the most pioneering molecular entomology methods come from. It's like the most molecularly advanced insect, and try to take
You
what
want to
had
follow
been
my writing. The Drosophila, I guess, is the Latin name for fruit fly. And I'm going to ask you, like, I think you're a chess player. You mentioned chess, but chess, I use the expression from the famous chess studies paper that say chess is the Drosophila of artificial intelligence or chess studies, if you've heard that expression.
cool. I agree. And yes, I do like chess. Maybe we can return there. So worked to apply some of these molecular methods to harvester ants, where some had been applied, but also many of these methods had not been applied. And along the way, I had a few antenna in some other questions and topics. And so I think the ones that we'll be talking about, or again, just that makes sense to start, would be with one foot in the ants, the other foot in philosophy and consciousness. What are the philosophical implications of how we think about and how we model the ant colony? And that's what led to some research on consciousness and really more reviewing the field, less about making claims about like whether humans or ants are conscious. I'll post links. And on the other hand, from the ant colony and generalizing more in the mathematical and formal direction to eventually lead to learning about active inference and free energy principle and all of that. So which avenue would you like to explore first?
Well, do you want to continue how you got involved with Active Inference Lab and what exactly is Active Inference Lab?
Yes, absolutely. So while I was in graduate school, I had the honor to connect with a visiting scholar named Martin Forger in 2017. And Martin was a French researcher and had a tremendous range of passions and commitments. He did his field work in the Amazon with various people there in a very on the ground way, but also he was interested in frameworks for consciousness and in mathematical formalisms of cognitive science and all these other areas. And in 2017, he initiated, again, while being a visiting scholar, a journal club at Stanford. And I participated in that journal discussion group. And I just thought these were amazing discussions and topics that we were not having in our regular lab meetings, our secular lab meetings, as it were. And that is what turned me on through Martin's interest and awareness of the free energy principle and Friston's line of research. Martin was a co-founder of a journal in a network really called Alias, which is a network of researchers that I'm now a part of and an editor at, for studying the diversity of states of consciousness related to cultural perspectives, molecular perspective, philosophical, and so on. But at that time, he was just beginning Alias. And there was an Alias bulletin. And the Alias bulletin was formatted as interviews with different active researchers in the area of consciousness study. Martin suggested, hey, let's interview Carl Friston. Let's raise some of these questions that we're having in this journal club, and let's frame them really well, and then let's see what Carl thinks. And so that resulted in 2018 with our publication, and I'll put the link in the chat here, with Carl Friston of Wood Lice and Men, where we asked a lot of clarifying questions and connected some dots that hadn't been connected before. Again, we're going to be coming back again and again to this like history and development of the active inference framework. But for now, just at a first pass, suffice to say that in 2018, there was less clarity differentiating free energy principle from active inference as a process theory and as a applied framework. And so we actually tackled that head on and got some amazing insights in 2018. And so the artifact was created. And then if I can add just one note there on that 2018 interview, Carl is an amazing scholar and really goes above and beyond in some of the most incredible ways. So we provided the set of questions to him for this interview. He improved our questions, added his responses, and then also added a supplemental individual contribution that was about his early childhood, entitled, Am I Autistic? So it's quite a read and a unique contribution that he made, just prompted. And that publication really motivated me and kind of lit a fire under the way that I was pursuing learning about active inference and some other topics. So in 2018, 2019, 2020, I was continuing to learn active inference and also work on applying active inference to the ant colony system, which we ended up publishing in 2021. The paper was called Active Infer Ants, and it was not the first multi-agent simulation in active inference. However, it was the first stigmergy simulation in active inference. So again, that's where there's a feedback process. Agents are making behaviors probabilistically based upon the state of the environment, and then they're modifying the environment in some way. This is really relevant, of course, for ant pheromones and for nest architecture and so on. But additionally, in a digital context, stigmergy is very important for understanding multi-agent online systems. A lot of times we'll see images of collective behavior like the flock of birds or the school of fish. And those are absolutely emergent properties, important collective systems. However, they're not modifying their environments in order to regulate and coordinate that kind of collective behavior. And so stigmergy, which, at least in my perspective, is under-considered in the field of collective behavior, helps us remember that agents can coordinate not just through direct interactions or communication, but through the environment as well. And so again, in the digital context, that's very important, where we can think about a link like a URL being shared as quite literally the initiation of a pheromone trail. And then we can think of like upvotes or downvotes or commentary as subsequent stigmergic modifications upon that initial link. So back to the thread with the active inference and the active learning. During 2020, there were some changes in everyone's life, I'm sure. And it was during that time in the middle of 2020 when I connected online via Discord, actually via the Lex Fridman Discord, with some of the colleagues who would later be co-founders of the Active Inference Lab. So in Lex's podcast number 99, he had an interview with Carl Friston talking about many of the topics we'll broach here, as well as consciousness, other things. And I was like, whoa, this is awesome. Lex is interviewing Carl, and got into some discussions with people on that, and connected with Alex and Yvonne, two colleagues who were very interested in learning active inference, applying active inference, communicating it, and also applying it specifically to the context of online teams and communities. So we wrote a paper in the end of 2020, on September 9th, 2020, where we explored behavioral modeling in online teams from an active inference perspective. So that was the first time that specifically the online team setting had been addressed in the active inference framework. We finished the paper, we put up the preprint, and then we said, well, what now? And the what next was based upon an assessment of the speed and the rapidity and the scope of development in the active inference field. However, also a recognition that there was a very small set of people who were contributing to much of the work, kind of like a power law distribution, but overall very scarce and overwhelmed logistically collaborators. There were some tools being developed, but nothing that was in standard practice. Some language was being used, some more or differently than others, but with little consistency, with all these kinds of little frictions towards learning, communicating, and applying active inference. And we perceived that in the context of research debt, which is when technological advances in a field without documentation, digestion, and so on can result in this like increasingly insurmountable amount of research debt. And so at the end of 2020, we founded the Active Inference Lab as a participatory online lab in the spirit of open science and participatory citizen science, so that we could learn and apply and communicate active inference together. And a lot happened since then, but I'll pause there while I forage for these links.
Okay, yeah, great. And if you want to do your own screen share to share some stuff, you just hit screen share and I'll share it. For my audience, my background is more theology and interfaith, although I studied physics and engineer, and always wanted to understand the scientific aspect of it. But I'm more I guess a mystic, and I came across or she came across me. I teamed up with Jennifer Scharf, Church of Entropy, who taught me about the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis of quantum consciousness, and she was specifically interested in the topic of reincarnation. And I also say, I guess, a believer in reincarnation, and the Kabbalists in Hindu leaning. But for the last 3 years, I've been following the Science of Consciousness conference, and we even attended online. This year's conference. I've been sharing these videos, and is there an overlap? I'm not sure if Carl Friston ever participated in that, or if there's some sort of competitive, there's a different models of consciousness, or there's different consciousness conferences. And it looks like, I'm not sure if Carl Friston, if he's, has disagreements with Hameroff or just didn't participate. But from my own study, I came across the predictive mind, and hopefully, because this topic is pretty complicated. Maybe Daniel, we talk briefly before we move into other topics. What exactly is active inference and the free energy principle? Maybe it's easier to start with the predictive mind, and saying is active inference an offshoot or from the school of the predictive mind. But I'd put that as, say, the mainstream materialistic theory of the brain working. Personally, I like the quantum mind, but Jennifer debated T-jump and John Frances Garepi, and I argue consciousness. But T-jump and John Frances Garepi argued that the quantum mind is unnecessary. That most of the materialistic brain researchers believe that consciousness could be explained without coming on to any quantum phenomenon. simply through neural circuits, and that would be the predictive mind through these Markov blankets and Bayesian statistics, Bayesian analysis. And I actually mentioned that in my chess articles that Bayes was a member of the Royal Society, and I think his didn't even publish. He had written in a letter his to somebody, and in his lifetime wasn't even considered important. But Bayes is 200 years, and Markov is like 100 years ago. So these are older mathematical ideas that are now been developed and became more popular. But I would say that's the mainstream materialistic model of consciousness, is without coming on to the quantum phenomenon, and that you would be able to use these Bayesian statistics to model the mind as a predictive machine in a certain sense. And I know we've talked about that a little bit in terms of eliminativism. So I'm not. Are you familiar with Stuart Hameroff? Is there an overlap between active inference and Stuart Hameroff and the Science of Consciousness conference, or do you have any insight on what I'm saying of terms the mainstream model thinks that there could be a material explanation of consciousness just from neural circuits without coming on to quantum phenomenon?
Great.
And then hopefully we could, if you could give us a brief overview exactly what is the free energy principle and what is active inference, or if you agree with my analysis that historically it's a sub-school of the predictive mind.
Great. Thanks for the questions and ideas. So I'm going to push down on the stack. What is active inference? What is the free energy principle? And what is the relationship between active and the FEP? Classic questions, the things I ask myself every day and that we discuss all the time, and by no means finalized questions, but definitely things I can give responses to. But first, since your interest and direction has to do with consciousness, I'll mention a paper. Yes. Okay. So right now you're showing of Woodlice and Men, the 2018 interview with Friston and Martin and myself. And in the last question, we actually did get to ask about ant colony consciousness. So that kind of closes the loop because it was things that I was interested in. And so first I'll address the consciousness directions that I've taken, and then we'll see how that relates to active. Here's the active model, and here's the paper that I'll be discussing just right now. Ant colony as a test for scientific theories of consciousness, with myself and with Erik Sovik, a colleague in Norway. So, looking at the ants, it's very easy to wonder different things. Proverbs 6:6, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, and so on, and several other ant mentions in all manner of good books. And I was also personally quite interested in consciousness, and I believe, as many are, infuriated or frustrated, geometrically frustrated, or insert your own term for how you felt when kind of faced with this immediacy yet ineffability of consciousness. And so you mentioned that like there's different leading theories or different popular theories or proposed theories in the field from a more secular, more materialist perspective, less secular, less materialist. And then there's all nature of like secondary claims made, like, well, that might be necessary but not sufficient, or we can explain phenomena behaviorally without appeal to X or Y or Z. So Erik is a honeybee researcher and also studied Drosophila. So we kind of had a shared history there. And he and I connected over this kind of joke that, well, starting as a joke, that people would fluctuate wildly in their ascertainment of ant colony consciousness. Not like it's a bad thing to be wrong or inconsistent or anything like that. But on one hand or 1 second, the same person would say, well, the nestmates are just automata. They're just doing what the queen says, right? Well, there's no long distance communication. So it's not like the queen is texting them or sending them like telepathy waves. The nestmates are making decisions for themselves out there while they're foraging. Oh, so then it's like the hive mind. And so it's kind of like this volatility that people would exhibit, fluctuating or juxtaposing essentially total autonomous, like removing all agency from all levels of the ant colony, and then very rapidly or seemingly with no contradiction, embodying perspectives that would have one believe in like a multi-level conscious awareness, like of the nestmate and or the colony. And so we, as behavioral researchers, kind of took a step back and we were like, there's a lot of inconsistencies in whether people even think people are conscious. So it's not surprising that there's debates around whether the ant colony has consciousness as well. The way we decided to go about doing this, rather than picking a pet theory and then evaluating whether the ant colony is going to check the boxes for the pet theory or not, is rather that we took a literature review perspective and we laid out a variety of different frameworks for studying consciousness. And we called this forward tests for consciousness. And what we meant by a forward test was kind of like if you had a scale that you trusted, it would be like a forward test for the mass of an object. The forward test means that you believe your calibration on your measurement device and you're going to go forward and you're going to test things out there in the world. And so an example of a forward test for consciousness would be anything where if it has X, then it's conscious. So it's kind of like a meter stick that we would be using to evaluate the extent of consciousness in the world of some system. And so some of those were purely physical, not even just like physical materialist, but like quite literally, if it has this kind of a brain region, like gross anatomical or micro anatomical, if it has this kind of connectedness structure, then it has consciousness. There were behavioral and cognitive traits that had been proposed as forward tests for consciousness, like the capacity for language or for certain types of communication. And also, importantly, there were various mathematical frameworks, such as integrated information theory. And we didn't actually explicitly go into the OR and the quantum side, but I'm familiar with those as well. We laid out all those theories and we said, great, those are the forward tests. They don't even come to consensus on humans. So again, it's not surprising they don't come to consensus on the ant colony. However, just for fun, what would these frameworks say about the ant colony? And so our vision was sort of to move to thinking about consciousness research in terms of different proposed forward tests and then different systems of interest, which are functionally reverse tests. Like the system is out there, and then we're going to sort of calibrate the test based upon what the system's evaluation under that forward test would be, so that we could get a matrix of what different frameworks would say about different systems, and that could be used to help us reduce our uncertainty about how to proceed in this field.
I'm not a biologist, but I would assume that ants have microtubules. Even plants have some microtubules, and even the number of neural cells that they have. And like Duvid is a dualist and a spiritualist, and largely came to whatever small internet fame I have debating against evolution. And consciousness is the main argument that I use, that consciousness is very difficult to explain materially at all, let alone how evolution would give rise to it. But without getting, hopefully we will discuss the dualism. But from the materialistic theories, which I would say is the mainstream school of biology, certainly if you go in university, most scientists are of the opinion that materialistic phenomenon of the brain can explain consciousness, and whether OR is a materialistic theory, even like Philip Goth and panpsychism, that you could be a materialistic panpsychic, but just from the OR quantum consciousness, I would assume that ants have microtubules, and that if there is some sort of panpsychism or quantum consciousness, that ants having microtubules would be able to exhibit it. Not only the queen bee, but the worker bee or worker ant, or any of them.
Yes, I'm always open to explore quantum mechanics. It's an important field.
Quantum consciousness, but I was saying that was for for the audience, that the Penrose was a physicist who came up with theories from the reduction of the wave equation and related it to information theory and consciousness. And Hamerov is an anesthesiologist who was studying the mechanisms of losing consciousness, so to say, during anesthesiology. And he read Penrose's famous book, The Emperor's New Mind, which mentioned from the information theory and the collapse of the wave equation to possibly giving rise to consciousness. And he said that maybe the microtubule could be the mechanism that biology uses, because Penrose's theory was pure physics and didn't have a biological mechanism. So microtubules are kind of these long chambers of symmetric tubes that exist in nerve cells that would be a ripe candidate and some evidence that they can harvest quantum phenomenon, that quantum particle. I'm not a physicist, but would be able to be caught in these microtubules. And all neuron cells have microtubules. I think there's also some other cells that have microtubules. Even plants have microtubules. So I would be almost certain that ants have some neural cells and some microtubules. So from that quantum consciousness perspective, that quantum phenomenon would be able to communicate through or exhibit that phenomenon even in ants.
Yes, the microtubules are shared broadly. The cytoskeletal architecture are shared broadly across life, depending on how one wants to think about different parts of the cytoskeleton and how everything got here. They go back a long time, and they're shared broadly. Also, ants and invertebrates more generally share a lot of the machinery of neurophysiology with vertebrates, mammals. So, yes, I heard you on the consciousness question, and we can definitely return to it. But just to make some points on ant brains that I think are super fascinating.
I throw in one more point before you say, just if it relates, because from the theological precursors of dualism, there's what's referred to as the interaction problem. And thanks to Ben Watkins, who I had some friendly conversations with, who I guess you're friendly atheist, but who's well read in the classics. So the interaction problem refers to the classic school of people who believe that there was a mind-body difference in a spiritual and physical world. And the question is, how do they interact? And would there be any evidence of the interaction? And from the questioning, because say dualism was probably the mainstream school of thought regarding consciousness up to a few hundred years ago, this interaction problem dates back to the ancient Greeks. And whether quantum consciousness or how you look at that, if quantum phenomenon or a material phenomenon, but so even if you are a spiritualist who believes that there's a soul and the soul is non-physical, then you have this interaction problem of, well, then how do the spiritual and physical communicate? And I think Daniel mentioned maybe he had a little or a knowledge of Kabbalah, and like Kabbalah is essentially designed to answer or explain the interaction problem like that. So that's also, hopefully in a bit I'll mention to Daniel my multiple truth hypothesis, but working with all these various possibilities at the same time of what's the origin of consciousness. Is it a non-physical phenomenon or a completely physical phenomenon? It's a physical phenomenon, then you're limited to the biological mechanisms to explain it. And if it's a spiritual phenomenon, then you have to deal with the interaction problem of how then does the spiritual have an effect on the material.
Yes. So a few points on ant brains, and then we can start to navigate towards Active and help see how that brings some cohesion and integrates across all these different cognitive systems, and maybe even some systems that aren't classically cognitive. One note, though, and one thing that I've always loved about science, and I hope stays embodied in participatory science and decentralized science, is a lot of people can believe something and it could be just a partial truth or incorrect or whatever. So even when something is the most cited in the field, or somebody's super famous, or they're the one who's getting invited to keynotes, there's always an opportunity for first principles thinking. And I hope that that doesn't change. I don't expect it to. So those who are listening, I hope that this is all in the spirit of an ongoing conversation that involves many, many perspectives. And it was one of our points in the ant colony consciousness paper, is that a lot is on the table with the consciousness question. Yes, for cognitive systems modeling, but for consciousness, it is quite literally like being the judge and the jury, all but the executioner with who is alive and what is alive. Those are essential applied topics. And so it's too essential for any kind of social scaffolding of science as a career to have a monopoly on answers there. So very interesting area with like applied ethics and the way that people's truth-seeking or curiosity-driven explorations of consciousness research really do have consequences. And same with ant brain investigations. So as mentioned, there's a lot of similarities with the ant brain and with other animal brains, and indeed with other life forms too. Like they share a lot of the same neurotransmitters, as well as the metabolic enzymes that generate those neurotransmitters, like dopamine, serotonin, and so on, and also many of the same receptors. And so in multiple experiments in the field, I was able to utilize molecules and drugs that would also have an effect on human neurophysiology and apply them to ants. So that's kind of fun and interesting, tying a little bit back to the discussion at the beginning about molecules and the shape of the molecules and the way that, yes, physical perturbations do influence behavior, even when it is an ant brain. And there's so many other interesting things to say about the ant brain, but just one that I'll note is while in the mammals, the brain size appears to grow with increasing social complexity. This is suggestive that social complexity is associated with theory of mind and with memory and game theory or any other kind of cognitive functions that make an individual in an increasingly complex society requiring increasingly complex onboard cognitive processes. In contrast, ants who are eusocial, the word means truly social, and for the ants, we can say that that's really the case because they're obligately colony living. There are no solitary ants in contrast with like wasps or bees. And so while honeybees, Apis mellifera, and some wasp species are eusocial, they do live in colonies obligately, most bee and wasp species are not colony living. Whereas all ants, hashtag all ants, and all termites, though termites are derived from cockroaches, whereas the ants, the bees, and the wasps are one group, the Hymenoptera, all the ants are colony living. So they've had a long time to hash out this interplay between nestmate level and colony level cognitive processes. And so in contrast with that trend in mammals with increasing social complexity and increasing neural complexity, in the ants, we see a trend with increasing colony size associated with simpler cognitive processes of nestmates because they're able to sort of off-source their cognition to other nestmates and to the environment through stigmergy. So I think that's very fascinating to think about just the diversity of cognitive systems and then what lessons we can learn when we make the appropriate generalizations from ant colony algorithms. How do they make nestmate level decisions about where and how to forage when they don't know how many seeds the colony has, how many seeds the colony needs, how many seeds are outside, where are the seeds outside? All of these attributes that it's as if important to know. So in other words, it's like you have to act as if it's important to know those features, but you don't necessarily need the parameter in your head, like an internal representation, but what one has to act as if those vital parameters are taken into account in decision making. Otherwise, that colony will fail to thrive. And as per Proverbs 6:6-8, that colony will not be able to gather up its harvest and persist through the winter.
I mean, people who follow me on YouTube know, I've done a lot of debating, counter Semites, and I went to a Freudian school that was based on the Frankfurt School, and so I talk a lot about group evolutionary psychology and these famous books, that I ended up, Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy, but then, do humans use group evolutionary strategy, which is a big question, generally in biology, and then how would that mechanism biologically work or for social purposes. But group evolutionary strategy, or just group strategies in general, are probably best seen and studied in ants, bees, these certain colony type, uh, usually insects, but all across the spectrum that function as a group. And there might be certain elements of whether there's a queen bee who reproduces in various topics. But this question of functioning as a group, and then phenomenon. If you're looking at a group of people, if it's like genetic, okay, like we're from the same genetic tribe and have the same DNA, therefore we're destined to function as a group. Or if you're more mystical, like there's some soul function, or from the same religion or the same practices that cause us to function as a group. Or if you want to dispel the phenomenon, say there is no such thing as a group functioning at all, but maybe simpler, to ask, how do you define consciousness? I know when I put consciousness, I usually put it in two different parts of the concept of the controller and decision making, like the unified I, that there's a David, a Daniel, that's a unified me that controls this body and makes decisions from a host of possibilities. And then there's also the classical part of thought and your reason and the workings of the mind as a function of consciousness, more from classical philosophy and theology, versus the scientific definition of consciousness is actually quite difficult. And if it's from anesthesiology, which also focuses on the controller, that scientifically a person is considered unconscious when they don't respond to feelings of their body, or they lose the, so to say, the controller. Person doesn't respond to command. And so if you could define your understanding of consciousness, and then the question, what does ant consciousness mean? And if from a spiritual perspective, you said, well, if someone has, do ants have a soul? And that would be related. Do ants have a controller or the ability to make decisions? And if you're, as a materialist, depending on how you define consciousness, and say, well, do ants think and make decisions, or you're saying they're purely mechanical automatons? And even to, the controller question, where a teleology, does consciousness, do ants have a purpose? Do ants have a will to survive? Do ants have a will to benefit the collective? And that's teleological. That where does that will to survive or will to benefit the collective derive from?
Big questions, and even after years of counting ants in the field and thinking about very little else other than just what number of ants I had seen and whether they were conscious or what it would mean, I still don't know. I think broadly there are the views from the outside when people talk about the intentional stance or behavior that appears to be driven. However, I think there's also the view from the inside with the actual phenomenology and the experience. And I don't think there's a single satisfying, addressable answer there. So in such uncertainty, I'm quite happy to be a methodological and even a theoretical pluralist. I barely even know what structure of arguments or what type of info or truth drop would reduce my uncertainty and work towards a synthesis of that view from the inside, the experiential, and the view from the outside. And that was really what we were dancing around or foraging towards in our ant colony consciousness paper, which is like, if we're going to approach this question seriously, then let's be on the same page in terms of what frameworks are out there, what is being proposed, and what is the structure of what they're even proposing. A lot of times when people think about an ant, they think about a six-legged nestmate, which totally makes sense because indeed the evolutionary unit, the replicator of the fly, is the six-legged fly. However, again, because they're obligately eusocial, the ant, the organism, the one that we might reference when we say that's one ant, could be thought of as being the colony. And in fact, that's one of the very classic papers of ant research, myrmecology, is Wheeler's, W.M. Wheeler's paper 1911, The Ant Colony as an Organism. This also relates to what you described about groups. So people will often think about the colony as a, quote, super organism. And I think they're super organisms, like they're amazing and fun as well. However, organism might be a better term to call them because, again, they are the functional unit of evolutionary replication, as well as physiology, behavior, and decision-making, and so on. And so by any of the constraints that would be applied to what is an individual bodily organism, there's no reason not for a colony to be considered an organism. There's a sense in which it's groups all the way down, like assemblages all the way down, without going into the tiny stuff, like whether there is some monad somewhere. What makes us not just a super single cell organism? And so it has to do with the physiological basis of being an organism and the evolutionary replication, like the replicator unit. So I don't know where the consciousness or the awareness of an ant colony would come into play, but at least in its current incarnations, science helps us approach some of the behavioral, physiological, and cognitive aspects of an ant colony and understand what kinds of cognitive processes are happening on board the nestmate, like detection of polarized light or visual scene recognition that's happening on the nestmate's body. And then there are a continuum of cognitive processes that include shells or layers beyond the nestmate's body, like cognition that occurs amongst nestmates, again, stigmergy with the nestmates and the surrounding environment. And so that's a lot like humans in some sense, where there's cognitive processes that happen on board, and then there's ones that happen like amongst people, like a conversation, and then ones also that are lightly or entirely scaffolded by technological systems like this live stream, for example. So there's a lot going on, and people have definitely gone into a lot of detail and heat and light around, are humans social, eusocial? Are we more like ants, or can a human live alone? So then what does it really make sense to say that humans are bodily organismal? All really important questions. And I know that you asked for the definition of consciousness and all of that, but I'm still researching and working on it. I want to learn more and think about how we can move beyond some of those framings that we had in our earlier paper to really, in a rigorous way, not just rigorous within the norms of science, but like rigor and living up to our highest values of accessible conversations and whatnot around, again, these topics that are just super vital. So now to bring it to FEP and Active, just to close this and then let you give a thought. Many people have approached consciousness with some of the newfound theoretical and formal machinery of free energy principle and active inference. Carl Friston has done it. Many others have done it as well. We'll get into it, but if I could just give one flag before we jump in, it is not in its essence a framework for consciousness, although it may very fluidly apply in some people's mind. And I'm not going to say what it is or isn't, because I'm not the final word on it, and 2022 is not the final year on it. But these are not frameworks that were developed towards explaining consciousness, especially of the awareness type, but rather they're frameworks that, for the free energy principle, exist to describe persistent systems, anti-dissipative systems, or systems that engage in repeated measurements, or they can be repeatedly measured, and active inference a bit more on a proximate, process-based, and mechanistic way. Active inference describes the process of perception, cognition, and action for different cognitive systems.
Okay, yeah, I like to give historical backdrop. So I'd written about this and mentioned so Helmholtz, I think, is a known name in physics. I'm not sure if he has an equation named after him, or but math and actually nerve theology. And then in 1867, he has this term unconscious inference, which is referring to nerve reactions, sense perception, and like electrical pathways. But so here, let's just quickly read the wiki definition of how they define free energy, and you'll see that there's an attached equation in active inference. So the free energy principle is a theory in cognitive science that attempts to explain how living and non-living systems remain in non-equilibrium steady states by restricting themselves to a limited number of states. It establishes that systems minimize the free energy function in their internal states, which entail beliefs about hidden states in their environment. That implicit minimization of free energy is formally related to variational Bayesian methods and was originally introduced by Carl Friston as an explanation for embodied perception in neuroscience. And I guess active inference and free energy principle at one point was kind of a blanket term for the same thing, and then they became separate, where active inference is a gradient descent applied to action. Motor control could be understood in terms of classical reflex arcs that are engaged by descending predictions. This provides a formalism that generalizes the equilibrium point solution to the degrees of freedom problem to movement trajectories. And I'd spoken to Daniel. I mentioned my article about Kotov and chess, what me and Jennifer termed reverse anthropomorphization, where our understanding of computers has increased, and from our understanding of computers, we have tried to map that onto the human mind, that say, well, what if the mind or humans work the way that a computer does? Although certainly Bayesian analysis predates the computer, so it was just pure mathematics that said, I believe Bayes had even wasn't even acknowledged in his lifetime, and just written a letter about his mathematical method that wasn't picked up till decades after his death to be realized that it would be very useful. But so the free energy principle, do you want to add something to this? How do you give a basic, what is this free energy principle? What is active inference? And what is the application to your area of research and the benefit? And obviously I came onto this for my own purposes, that I was looking for a tool to use to advance my own theories, even of dualistic theology, multiple truth hypothesis. But I believe that this framework could possibly even be applied to what I'm trying to do. And as I said, I consider this the mainstream materialistic theory of what I call consciousness. And then just the word consciousness is controversial, because if you're a limitivist, then you're saying that consciousness doesn't really exist. It's not an accurate description of the phenomenon. And then if you're looking at it from an equation perspective, where if you have accurate equations that describe these processes, and then you try to put those terms into words, or even to map that onto classical theology or philosophy that used words to describe phenomenon, and now we have maybe these equations that describe these phenomenon better, and then try to map that onto the lexicon from psychology and philosophy, or maybe if it could even be eliminativist and say that historically people didn't really understand the phenomenon that well and did our best to describe what we experienced, but had flawed explanations. And I guess I use the term explanatory power, like capital T truth, that if we truly discover this is how things work and it's definitive, versus theories that have explanatory power, but have intrinsic problems, contradictions, and sometimes competitive theories have more or less explanatory power, where one theory could have a lot of explanatory power in a certain subfield, and then less explanatory power in another subfield, is where it might be a competitive theory that even has contradictory axioms that has more explanatory power in one subfield versus the other, which is kind of where my multiple truth hypothesis was coming in, to deal with these competitive theories that have different levels of explanatory power and often conflicting axioms.
Awesome. So I'll make some historical notes and then take a 55 on what is active and what is FEP, because it's truly, I hope, for everyone to continue exploring and getting involved in, if they want to participate actively in Active Lab and in other endeavors that happen in the future. And again, the book is not finished. But first, just a historical note, because you showed the unconscious inference, Helmholtz, you mentioned Bayes and Markov. I think it could be a more precise linguistic operating environment if we didn't use people's names. We should cite copiously, because credit is important to assign where credit is due. However, each of these people may have done many things, and it can be extremely ambiguous and bring along baggage that doesn't necessarily need to come into the discussion to invoke any individual as if it could be used as a descriptor for a process. So just wanting to say that. And so I'll use terms as I think they will hopefully be understood, but it also is a little bit always a non sequitur to describe the ideas as belonging to the person, especially when they've developed so much. And it's kind of like picking one point in the river and delineating that as the event, even if it's an impactful part in the river. So unconscious inference, you showed, is something that, yes, we can trace it to whomever, whenever, but it's something that we from first principles can discover for ourselves. We have a blind spot in the eye. There's a location in the eye where there is not visual acuity, and also the eye does not have homogeneous visual acuity or color perception. There's a lot finer resolution in the center, and then it gets a little bit less colorful and less resolution around the edges. However, our visual perception is not evidencing that. We could say from this perspective of the predictive mind that our visual experience is a generative model, or it can be modeled using a generative model that is creating the sensory consequences of latent inferred states, and then that is compromised by incoming sensory data. And so Helmholtz and others did make key contributions in understanding how what was experienced was like this compromise that got updated between ongoing predictions and ongoing perceptions. So that is like one of the very important pieces of perception. And that is a qualitative argument. It can be brought into a more formal context using Bayesian mathematics. Bayesian mathematics, as in contrast with frequentist mathematics, gives degrees of freedom around choosing the prior. And in Bayesian statistics, the prior is basically how likely things are thought to be with respect to this concern before any new evidence comes in. And then the new evidence that comes in is either lightly or strongly brought into convergence with the prior. So a strong prior would be when like whatever data comes in, it doesn't update the prior much into the posterior. So that could be analogous to a situation where like a person is resistant to new information coming in. There's kind of this like prediction being made, and then it's not being updated with respect to new data. So the downside of that is you fail to learn from the outside world, but you might have benefits like simplicity or stability of belief. In contrast, a weak prior would be one where like new data points coming in moves it wildly. And so that one can imagine has the opposite set of issues, which is like it might update you too rapidly to basically static or stochastic fluctuations that are not useful to track. But in contrast, that kind of a system is highly responsive. And this system, just like we're kind of seeing here, can be visualized in a graphical format. In graphical, it's a bit of a pun there, a Bayesian network, like the figure shows, because it's both graphical in the conversational sense as being visual, as well as being related to a graph. And so Bayes graphs, Bayes networks represent nodes as random variables. And this is also what we're seeing here is actually a type of Bayes graph in the free energy principle page there. The variables are nodes and edges are statistical relationships amongst the nodes. Now, we can learn from simple examples like, okay, well, there's going to be one node called the temperature of the room, which we're not directly observing. And then it's going to be connected to another node called the thermometer reading, which is not literally the temperature of the room, but we're going to be able to learn the statistics of how they're related to each other. So that because part of it is observable, like the thermometer, and part of it is unobservable, which is like the temperature in the room, we can think about that as kind of being like a simple, partially observable Bayesian model. Now, what we're looking at here is a specific way of partitioning various states of cognitive systems. And so the top example with the cell and the bottom example with the brain are utilizing the same partitioning. The mother of this partitioning is what Judea Pearl in 1988 and elsewhere called the Markov blanket. Now, the Markov blanket refers to the set of states upon which two other sets of states, internal and external states, become conditionally independent. So person A only talks to person B, B also talks to C. Person B is like the Markov blanket between A and C. It makes A and C conditionally independent. So it doesn't mean that the information doesn't get from A to C. It just means that there's some intermediating node or nodes that make internal and external states conditionally independent. Any Bayes graph that isn't fully connected is going to have some Markov blankets. Again, it's like a last name and a metaphor. It is neither Markov nor it is a blanket. But think about what it actually technically means, which is this kind of partitioning by which all these states come into being at the same time. Not that they're created, but in the model, they are co-instantiated. So it's not that the features of the world can be labeled as like, well, this is an internal state, and that's a blanket. These are tags or like annotations on variables that all co-instantiate. And from a different partitioning or different model, you could get a different setup. Now, what the focus of the free energy principle and active inference are systems that appear to be active. It's right there in the title. So every time I think, what is active inference? I think it's there in the title. It's about action and inference. It's about the various ways in which action plays a role in the inferential process. And we can think about just a few like off the top of our head. One of them is inference is often about action. That's like planning and decision making. So there's various important cases where action is literally the target of inference. And that's often been in the fields of like control theory, cybernetics, which are also seen as goal-driven. We could also think about the role that action plays in inference. So for example, our visual perception appears quite stable, but actually, especially like when reading or when looking at things that are changing, there are these eye saccades. And so those eye saccades can be seen as a very carefully orchestrated sequence of actions, which require planning, that are all, quote, subconscious. So that's why for some, we've left consciousness long, long, long behind, because we're talking about subconscious inference processes. And those eye saccades are what facilitate and enable the generative model, again, which appears to have high resolution and color everywhere and no blind spot, that is facilitated by a non-perceived sequences of actions. And the eyes will move to what is most informative. Now, in the temperature in the room and the thermometer case, it's pretty simple. But we might want to bring action into that picture by now being able to take policies based upon affordances. So sequences of actions that we could take, policies, based upon the actions that we can take, affordances. And that term comes from ecological psychology. We might be interested in modifying the temperature, and that would change the thermometer readings. So instead of just like breaking the thermometer and changing the number, we can modify the process by which the temperature is changing. So that's already bringing us into the realm of control theory and partially observable, because the temperature was not observable, but the thermometer was. Markov decision processes. Markov, in that sense, is being used to refer to the fact that time is acting like a Markov blanket. The influence of the past on the future is only happening through the present. So a Markov process is kind of like a Markov blanket through time, which again is one reason why we don't need to appeal to last names. We could just speak specifically. That is getting us much of the way to active inference, which is a specific way of utilizing this partitioning that we're seeing here to implement various modeling architectures such that behavioral systems, curious systems, active systems, strategic systems can be modeled. So active inference is a behavioral modeling framework. Just like linear models are not falsifiable, but any given linear modeling approach might be like adequate or not, active inference doesn't really make sense to discuss as being falsifiable or correct or even incorrect. However, any given active inference model that's constructed could be evaluated in terms of its adequacy or in terms of its relative preference that somebody has for it versus other frameworks. Active inference has been described as a corollary process theory, which is to say a cousin, a related theory of the free energy principle. The free energy principle is a bit more grounded in the physics of action and information, but it relates to the imperative of systems that are going to be measured multiple times over some time scale have to be at least acting like they're persisting. Now, for some systems over some time scale, the persistence might be so trivial that we don't need to appeal to cognitive functions to describe their persistence. Like, I measured this rock 3 times over the last 5 minutes, its width, and the width was the same. So I don't need to appeal to anything cognitive about this rock. However, for far from equilibrium biological systems especially, we do need to appeal to behavior to understand how they can be persistently measured or persistently measure themselves in a small attracting set of states, which we might call homeostasis. And so free energy principle provides some very deep and powerful physics grounding for repeated measurement and for systems that resist dissipation and are subject to repeated measurement. Active inference, using this same partitioning of internal, external, and blanket states, is able to provide us with process models in the form of Bayesian graphs and other formalisms that help us, just like a linear model would help us find the line that explains variance between X and Y. These active inference models help us explain the variance in models of perception, cognition, action, and impact in the niche.
Hey, great. Thanks for that. So that's what, Ali in the chat who I've spoken with has been on the last few streams saying that it's descriptive, not prescriptive, and it's not necessarily coming to answer the philosophical questions. It's using a statistical or mathematical framework, maybe even algorithmic, to describe things. And I guess it'd be more, it's Bayesian, it's more algorithmic because it has a feedback mechanism, which I guess could be related to calculus or differential equations, but the environment feeds back in to create some sort of self-correcting mechanism, which obviously that's how perception works, but to have the equations that describe it. So what about the lab in terms like there's the theory, is there actually like a location? Is the lab a think tank at a university, or is it just is it just a YouTube page or just a Discord, or you have a board of directors and a mission statement?
Yes, great question. So as we explored a little bit earlier, at the end of 2020, we began the Active Lab as a place where people who were curious and interested in active inference, whether they were in academia or outside or any stage of life, any background in mathematics, any passion that was motivating them to do so, could get involved with learning and with participating and contributing in this field. So one of our projects has been the live streams, the paper discussions, as well as the guest streams that we have, which are more like a presentation. But we've made many other projects that are ongoing. So
we use the word place. Is there actually a brick and mortar place to it also?
There's no physical building or location for Active Lab. It's an online organization, and it is its own entity. Various projects exist, and we hope to be scaffolding education and research and participation for a long, long time to come. Some of the projects that are quite fascinating, first, just starting most related to those live streams, is an active journal where we curate the transcripts of live streams and augment and improve them so that they can be utilized for scholarship and citation, because there's so many pieces of information that are shared that people will vaguely know happened during a live stream, but this brings it into a searchable, indexable, and citable form, as well as the creation of subtitles for videos and translations, which improves accessibility in a global learning context. We also have the ontology development project, where we've been developing the language and the relationships amongst terms for active inference. That brings consilience in the field because we can use terms appropriately and don't need to add extra details. And it isn't just an ad hoc response or an expert-driven response when somebody might ask, how is term A related to term B? Those are also amenable to having computational sense-making systems learn from these ontological representations. And there's been a bunch of other projects, and I'd encourage anyone to, yes, go to activeinference.org and check out how to participate, or just stay tuned. But there's so much more to come. And there's our scientific advisory board. So we have many great advisors there and elsewhere. And again, we'll have some changes coming soon and improvements that will bring things to another level as well. So the lab's a new kind of educational and science entity in a sense. And we're looking for participants, because what's always hard is to find high quality attention and people who will want to get involved, and no one needs to be an expert. We scaffold each other's participation in the colony so that we can have a collective cognitive process that goes like way, way beyond what any of us could do alone. So if you're taking notes on active papers, or if you're listening to podcasts, or if you're having conversations with your friends about it, it's perfect for you to get involved, any time zone, any mathematical background, because just the more people who want to get involved and be a part of it, the better it's going to be. And one never really knows what will happen when they get involved with these kinds of endeavors.
Yeah, I guess you're not like directly in consciousness studies in the sense like we first talked. I mentioned interfaith and spiritual understandings, and I find that the majority of people interested in consciousness are spiritual seekers. That the science of consciousness is a relatively extremely limited field. Has said that it's usually housed in medical schools, specifically related to anesthesiology or sleep studies. That of the handful of science of consciousness university departments, I believe they're all in either the medical school of anesthesiology, or a few related specifically to sleep studies. And the way science is funded or research, that you want it to have some practical use. And in terms of medicine, the main practical use is for anesthesiology and sleep. And then also you have neuropsychology, that the philosophy, psychology departments historically were introspective. They weren't related to neurology. In the beginning, you had psychometrics, which is really only like 150 years old, which was actually measuring the output of mind without like the neurocorrelates of mind or integrated information theory, where you're trying to have some sort of biological mechanism to correlate to what's happening. And at this point, psychology has moved a lot into neuropsychology, that like Freudian or various theories, that you want some sort of neural correlate or device that directs to it, as opposed to consciousness. And everybody has a mind, everybody uses it, and therefore especially people who are into meditation tend to have interest in consciousness. And that could be people who do things like chant or pray regularly. If you're an Orthodox Jew or Hindu, or even Protestant evangelical, or someone that has a regular prayer in their life and meditates. And so that, like, Hamerov notes that, like, his conference started in the 90s just from a handful of people in Arizona, and then he invited some big names early. Even had Benjamin Libet before he passed away. One of the early conferences, David Chalmers, and a lot of the big names. But the majority of the people who go to the conference are more spiritual seekers, and even narcotics. So anyone who attends the Science of Consciousness conference knows that one of the big things is narcotics. And so if you're, like the finance aspect of how do you fund something, so if you're a university institute, you need an endowment, and then the endowment might be centered around solving some sort of medical problem, or you need participants that buy tickets. And so if it's a Science of Consciousness conference, you have a handful of think tanks, but the majority of people who buy tickets are more spiritual seekers or narcotic users. So that's the interesting. So if active inference, if you're going to have a colloquium of scientists, it's probably pretty difficult. Like the Allen Institute, I mentioned Paul Allen, who was one of the founders of Microsoft, one of the richest people in the world. I believe he donated $100 million, and he chose Christopher Koch, who I think was a neurobiology teacher at Caltech or UC, one of those schools, to be the head of the institute. So they're extremely well funded, or various things. But generally funding, if you're in the academic circle, so it's the Allen Institute of Brain studies or something like that, and it's more directed versus just people are interested in the topic that applied science. I don't know if like DARPA or the Department of Defense or National Science Foundation would be funding these type projects. So I don't know if you have a response to what I'm saying, or the nature that the majority of the people in the topic, they're interested in the topic, are going to be non-scientific spiritual seekers, and then the people that might have a scientific background might have a bias against the topic of consciousness, or this kind of output directed relation that is related to the way science is funded, where it would have to somehow make some specific discovery about how the brain works or some medical advancement.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Here's what came to mind when you were talking. I thought about kind of three archetypes, three legs of a stool. There's pragmatic at the individual level. So you mentioned like people who are meditators, or they're practitioners of some skilled performance or some other sort of talent or some practice, like chess, for example. But they're interested in what science and what research applies to them at the individual level in their physical life or in their metaphysical life. Then there's pragmatic at the organizational or institutional level. Like you brought up some applied science, and you brought up the example of like anesthesiology, and the way that there's an institutional home in this applied setting of medicine, which is like an applied research area. And then the third leg of that stool, the third archetype, is kind of like theory. And there are sometimes tenuous relationships amongst these, because it is challenging and there is quite a process to go from basic theoretical research through translational and applied research into actual application, whether again at the institutional or at the individual level. And cognitive science is something that definitely swirls across all of these three. And cognitive science is so interesting because, as you've brought up with those who said, well, consciousness is not even a needed concept, or we might even say that's a deflationary perspective on behavior. Like we can explain behavior using materialist frameworks. Cognitive science is of obvious pragmatic value to understand for individuals and for groups. I don't need to name any projects or groups, but everyone can think about what kinds of groups and individuals would be interested to understand cognitive science and the decision-making and the inference and action processes and the way that different stimuli play into that and so on. And here, coming from the top, is this theoretical framework of active inference, which is providing a first principles approach to thinking about cognitive systems and taking a fresh light on some classic questions like perceptions, but also bringing a lot of integration across different cognitive systems. For example, there's been long debates on extended, embedded, encultured, et cetera, 5E, 7E, 11E cognitive systems. And when the debate is in prose, it's easy to get lost because people make claims and it's a good claim or not, but it doesn't really accrete or apply. When we have formalisms, not as the whole iceberg, but as part of the iceberg, we can actually take a theory-guided approach to those pragmatic questions in our individual life and at the sort of institutional or project level. So many fascinating things that I've heard over the years about people applying active inference to their own life and reinvestigating their own thought processes. And we've also seen active inference applied to areas beyond just individual cognition, whether, again, at the individual sort of day-to-day or the more medical, like psychopathology side, because active inference is built upon scale-free formalisms, which is to say, it doesn't a priori assume what scale or system one is applying to. So if one's theory of consciousness was that it had to do with this part of the brain, then it's a brain-bound theory. Whereas a scale-free formalism allows comparison of different cognitive systems. And scale-free is not esoteric. A linear model is a scale-free formalism. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a regression of centimeters versus milligrams or kilometers versus kilograms. The axes can be anything. So we can kind of think of that like axes can be anything for linear model and apply that to cognitive and behavioral systems. That is allowing people to apply active inference to remote teams, to organizational design, to startups and entrepreneurship, to natural capital, to economic systems. There's so many other places where active inference can be applied because it's almost like giving us the design language or the grammar or some templates and motifs from cognitive systems that we might know and love, including the ones that we have deep interior familiarity with, but also allow us to integrate with systems that we don't need to get into the debate of whether it's having an experience or not, though people are welcome to do that. But we can model, for example, computer systems using Markov blankets, like an interface in engineering. Or we could model something like a cellular organelle. And instead of needing to predicate our discussion on whether, well, it does have microtubules, but is it doing this much information integrating or not? That is a yes and with being able to model that system as if it's engaging in strategic behavior in order to persist in a dissipative environment. So active inference provides us with many model-based affordances and opportunities for connecting different cognitive systems and just taking a yes and perspective. And there's always going to be time for all the debates that we've had. Although in another sense, there's never enough time. And active inference is bringing in a toolkit of formalisms and models and software packages that help us move beyond prose-based argumentation and debate and really get onto the paper, onto the computer notebook, whatever it is, using an ontology that allows the patterns across systems to be made explicit and to develop that for epistemic and pragmatic ends.
Yeah, I mean, people who follow my channel, said like I actually started my channel, to teach people Hebrew prayers. Like I might fill in here. I was trying to help out a synagogue in Detroit and create a minyan, and people weren't familiar with the prayers, so the language barrier, and then a lot of people don't have experience in saying formalized the same prayer over and over again. Just like, why should I'm going to repeat this exact same prayer, every single day for the rest of my life. But okay, so I'm an Orthodox Jew. I went to Orthodox schools, and I've been saying these prayers every day for decades, and I probably continue to say them for the rest of my life. And so if you're looking, and also I got involved in Hinduism, and I would say that probably even the majority of people interested in these type fields are spiritual seekers who like, okay, my goal is to improve my prayer connection, and I'm skeptical of the scientists because they tend to be atheist, but I want to know what the science says, because I think I'm going to be able to kind of pull out some of the stuff and improve my ability to pray. And I had a little bit of that, although I was raised more secular and had atheist period in my teen years, to somewhat that perspective, like skeptical of these scientists. They're all a bunch of atheists, but they probably know something about the human mind, and I want to cipher through what they're saying to improve my meditative experience. And then there's also, okay, I'm a chess coach, and I like mental techniques, and one of the big things I talk about is chunking theory, which is more psychometric, than cognitive, because I mean it's based on like Miller's early experiments in the short-term memory and the 7+2, and this concept of there being a hard limit on short-term memory processing of 7 plus or minus 2 items. But if you could chunk larger pieces of information together, so it doesn't mean 7 basic units, but they could be 7 extremely large units, or template theory. And I learned speed reading when I was young, and you see all the books. I have a popular speed reading video. I've taught hundreds of people speed reading, and chunking theory is basically the basics of speed reading. And you mentioned cicadas earlier, and even the formulations of predictively how much could the mind possibly, how fast could the eye movements or whatever, to a hard limit on what a mind could do in terms of speed reading or processes. But for like as a chess coach, similar to like a prayer, if you do the prayer service every day and be like, let me give you this thing to think about. When you reach this part of the prayer service, focus on this. And you could have internally, you could explain something to somebody in their meditation practice, and then they could be like, oh, I tried it and it worked, and I had this experience, which is contemplative. It's an introspective process as opposed to a scientific process. And even if you're looking at chess performance or the theory of expertise, which is, we'll say, more scientific. You mentioned Drosophila, and the chess is the Drosophila of cognitive research, because there's different performance levels of chess or expertise in general, and then you have things like chunking theory to help explain what's the difference. But you could teach someone a mental technique. You could look at someone's game. We could analyze your game and say, oh, like I think why don't you think about this? And then you say, well, I'm having better results, and you have rating performance. But in terms of mental technique that helped a person self-improve, and to some extent there's a disconnect between also like religion and science, meditation and introspective and science, and mental techniques and experts and in science. Like top chess players tend to be not have college education, and generally, like if you're very young and a chess prodigy and you want to be from the best, you have to dedicate everything to it, and you can't go to university. And if you go to university, and for a lot of performative things like that, so also among chess players or any math memory competitions, there's also a disconnect between science and top performance, where you could have like, well, I got a PhD in cognitive science, and here's this like chess savant that beats me every time. But the chess savant might have these techniques that he could explain to somebody else that would work, even though they're not based on science, and might even read scientific papers. Like, my goal is to become better at chess, and I'm skeptical of the scientists, but let me read through their material just to see if there's anything that could increase my expertise. And that's probably the majority of people, because people have a PhD or the academic background to really delve into this is going to be very limited. So you have a bigger reach. And then simple people, not necessarily simple people, I'm saying that you're just average people that well, will this make me smarter? And you say, well, that's not really how it works. That's not what the theory says. But the person is, well, is it going to make me smarter or not? And say, well, it might. Yeah, it'll help you understand your mind better, and might help increase your cognitive output. And things like speed reading or expertise could be measured. So that's if you have your lab, which is a colloquium of largely experts in interdisciplinary studies. I wanted to talk to you about interdisciplinary studies, but I wanted to hit you on that issue because I have a bachelor's degree and some master's work, civil engineering, but I'm more an intellectual. I'm not an academic. My academic background, I don't have a PhD. I went to University of Michigan. I do generally good on tests, but I'm not an academic in that way, and I wouldn't be able to get into any of these conferences, because I don't have that. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD, but I might be able to beat you at a game of chess, or I might be able to prove somehow in a mental performance that I understand something to a certain level that I could demonstrate in a cognitive performance. and I might even, as I've taught hundreds of people how to speed read, even though there's some criticism in the scientific community of whether speed reading is actually a phenomenon. You say that a lot of people reject it, or the meditative experience where saying like between Orthodox Jews who say these prayers every day, you could talk about the mystical experience and what does it mean to have a really great prayer service. Prayer service went great today, versus a person who doesn't pray. Like, what does that mean? What does that even mean to have to be an expert on introspection? And even if you interview, because I've been doing interfaith for like Swami, Goswami, usually master of our own senses, master of our own mind. That like I'm involved in Hinduism. I think you told me your father even took you to India. But you say people may not have much of a formal education, but they've mastered their own senses, they've mastered their own mind, and even someone maybe spent decades in university. You could speak to say a spiritual master who has somewhat mastered their own senses and mastered their own mind, and through their power of reflective experience, or their ability to observe our own mind, could maybe have some more insight on these theories. So where do you come? I haven't seen any like swamis or rabbis or priests or interfaith on your channel, but where would it come out? And the Science of Consciousness Conference had a study on shamanic practices, where they had they found a bunch of people who did shamanic practices, and then they studied the neural waves, and they found that they did exhibit certain brain activity, that heightened brain activity in a neural correlate of consciousness, that demonstrated that these shamanic practitioners did in fact have some sort of heightened brain activity versus psychometrics. Because obviously, you could give IQ tests, you could play a game of chess, you could give a bunch of puzzles and a psychometric to demonstrate this guy has expertise in psychometric output.
Yeah, a lot there. Here's what it made me think about. There's science, the career, the people who are paid to be in fields that are deemed to be scientific fields, in academia or not. Some people are involved in it. Greetings, Jen. Science as a body of knowledge in what's been constructed, and science as an approach which is timeless. And so I'm always happy and try my best to be an advocate for different life stages and educational backgrounds to participate actively on the level that they want to be participating in, because it just is not an in-group conversation. There's times for fractal in-groups in research and in education.
But I've been following your page. I've only seen scientists there. I mean, the people have interest, but saying that like almost every it's people who've written scientific papers. Almost all the people have academic credentials. Maybe you're panelists, that you allow panelists that are non-scientists to join the conversation. But so I haven't seen you interview a Swami or something like that.
You're right. It has not happened, and the invitation is open for people who feel like their work is relevant. We are open to it and developing. And on my own personal YouTube channels, if people want to even go further afield, we can do that. And I hope it's just a conversation that expands in many directions, because there's many people who have perspectives that are important to share. That being said, it is a research field, so making sure that we at least know what we're talking about and have at least once covered many critical ideas gives us actually a more stable platform to include other types of discussions. Otherwise, we meet in the middle with no stigmergy, and it's just an uncoordinated flock of birds. But when we have actual discussions around specific artifacts or using the ontology of active inference, then we actually have a really positive setup for inclusive discussions around active and other fields too.
I know you said 2 hours about, so we're even approaching that. And Jennifer, we had a time because I thought it was going to be 1 p.m. Pacific time, and Daniel's on the West Coast. So thank God my streaming partner Jennifer has been able to join. She was the one who informed me about the Hameroff-Penrose hypothesis, and Ali informed me you got Stephen Grossberg. I have his book. I've mentioned Grossbergian and the resonant mind many times on my channel. I've been following that also for years, and I would say that there's Friston and Grossberg, some of the main schools and theories of consciousness, whether they overlap or not. But if I could hand over to Jennifer, maybe if she asks different things on the quantum mind. I'm not sure how much time you have left, but I appreciate her joining.
30 minutes or a little more would be totally fine. And yes, next Tuesday with Ali, we'll have Stephen Grossberg on.
Thanks, David. Is my sound all right?
Yeah, you sound fine.
Yeah.
A little quiet, but you're fine.
Sorry about that. Great to meet you, Daniel. Really love to be part of your Discord. And I did hop in to a meeting recently. I was super excited. I think you were on there, or maybe not. Did we actually talk on voice?
No.
Okay.
No.
My bad.
But some other participants.
Must be because I watched your videos and I felt like you're just so friendly that we're like friends already. But yeah, I watched the last one that you were kind enough to have David on, and I was pretty impressed, I gotta say. So I had some notes on that. Like, my background is basically consciousness studies, and my adventures have led me to understand that, like, when you go into talking about consciousness, it's only a matter of time before somebody gets upset, put it lightly. So if I could help anybody who's a fellow traveler on the path to discovering consciousness, I'd love to do that. I think the place I could help would be in making sure that there's no, because I noticed on the last stream that you your eyes kind of perked up when somebody mentioned the possibility of redefining consciousness. I don't know if you remember that. And you were like, "Oh, well, are we sure we don't want to go to this?" And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your concern was there.
In 46.2, this most recent discussion, it came up?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the very most recent one where someone mentioned, well, would it be possible to redefine consciousness this way? And then your eyes sort of opened up really wide. And I was just wondering if you could go into like what your concerns were with that. And I guess because I see it, like, I'm hopeful for your project because you seem to have an appreciation for the scope of consciousness. Like, I guess I see that as one of the many signs that are like positive for a project when someone's not sort of brushing off the complexity of the phenomenon. I guess I was just wondering why I don't know if you had any comments about how you define consciousness, or if you had really anywhere to.
Yes. I think if that was my response, then my possible thought process was the regime of attention in the paper discussions, though we're not just literally quoting from the paper, are about the paper. That paper was not about consciousness. In fact, it made very specific detail to not approach it and cite very clearly to the author's other work and to other researchers' work around different approaches for studying consciousness. And so I really like the freewheeling live stream format. I love live streams and paper discussions and other formats. And I think there's absolutely a time and a place, especially with note taking and people looking at the same artifact, so that it isn't just rhetoric being tossed around, but there's actually a colony collaboration on what is being said. So I think there's, again, years deep also into studying consciousness, including our review that we talked about earlier in this stream. I have not seen a conversation with no note-taking be super helpful. However, when there is a common artifact that people can pay attention to, I think it can be immensely helpful. So potentially that just was not the right moment as a facilitator in my evaluation. Doesn't mean it's correct to go that much further afield from the specific paper. And that's what grants those paper discussions, I hope, longevity and impact in their transcripts is that they do reflect addendums and questions on the seed artifact. And then we can totally create spaces to not just in a haphazard way address like a redefinition question of consciousness, but actually tackle that and bring different voices into the conversation. And again, make sure that we have like notes being taken so we can get somewhere better at the end of that conversation.
Yeah, that's just great. I have notes on your last presentation, but I'm not exactly sure what to ask because a lot of the times the terms are just sort of, I don't want to say they're too vague, but is there some way that a more precise definition of consciousness could help you with your work? Or like basically, where is root consciousness in the hierarchy of your model? Are you sort of putting it under the hood, or like how deep of an adaptive capacity, I guess, or is that even the focus of what you're doing? Because I'm sorry, I still don't quite see like a bird's eye snapshot of your work, and that's totally on me, not you.
Yeah. So
Or maybe help clarify also, because me and Jennifer have been doing Week in Review for like 3 years, and we get a little it's hard to build up an audience and then to stay on track where you develop kind of your own lexicon or narrowcasted. And if you just, okay, well, we stream every week, or you have a series of author paper interviews or guest interviews, and what does it mean for someone new joining? And if you've narrowcasted yourself, or you created your own little lexicon or cast of characters, that it becomes very difficult for someone joining new to learn, like, well, what is their jargon? Who are these cast of characters? And various things that so how does someone jump in? So I am so
I'm
interested
sure he
in the
means
topic.
cast of characters in the most flattering way possible.
Well, I was so interested in the topic that I started watching your videos in 2-speed, but from number one, and I'll probably catch up, and that will mean that I'll watch the a few hundred hours of the content. But I'm really interested in the topic, and you assume that there's going to be very few people who are going to do that. But how does someone so to say jump right in, or if you're going to write like some sort of like primer for joining Active Inference that would have like a glossary and a cast of characters?
okay, so a lot of things there. First, to participate, the entry is to go to activeinference.org and complete the form. You will then be presented with a variety of opportunities for educational settings. It's not just a live stream lab. That is a very restricted affordance. Not like we prevent people from joining, but not everybody wants to do public speaking permanently, transcribed, indexable, searchable, citable, etc. However, there are so many opportunities for more open discussions that are unrecorded and so on. So if you want to have conversations around active inference in our Discord and in many other places, that is absolutely possible, as well as especially asynchronously contributing to various kinds of education projects. Like, for example, the live streams we had in number 40 on quantum, the free energy principle for generic quantum systems. We will increase the impact of that kind of a conversation with the authors when we can make it citable and searchable. Okay. Narrowcasting, very interesting point about the sort of like live stream strategy game. And it's very important to balance many things in the streams. What motivated that format, our initial format with the paper discussions, was hearing paper discussions in academia, and whether it was like a sort of half effort where a few people read the paper and somebody shared some slides, or whether it was like a super amazing emergent experience where many people read the paper and really gave it thought and brought improvements and critiques, at the end, it would just dissipate. The sound waves would dampen, the slides would be forgotten, and sometimes there was like truly important criticisms, and I was always asking myself, wait, we're not going to like write a letter or a comment or a blog? We're not going to even take notes on what's happening? We're just going to truly make it an in-group discussion because of the limited accessibility of like this conference room on this Tuesday. So that kind of blew my mind.
All work and no pay. I mean, if you had like a huge endowment and we're like, okay, like I'm going to slide you a few $100s to write something up, or you got to get some real geeks, like some real consciousness nerds that are, you say like, please give me homework for no pay. Or then you have to, or some sort of value proposition like, no, I'm telling you that just join Active Inference and do all this stuff to benefit it, and your mind is going to improve. You're going to gain 10 IQ points, and you're going to understand all the stuff that you previously couldn't understand.
In Active Inference, the framework, the decision making, which is of course one of the most essential pieces of any decision making framework, the imperative for decision making, in contrast with reward learning, which has a pragmatic value centrism. So even things like curiosity and novelty have to be assigned a pragmatic value in order to shoehorn them back into this sort of pragmatic centered view. In Active Inference, we can talk about pragmatic value and epistemic value. So that's what allows these types of active entities to engage in curious behavior, because they're able to undertake decisions and rapidly switch between behavioral modes of reward seeking and of information gathering. Even though information gathering is always ongoing, actions can be selected that are more epistemic or more pragmatic. So that's what kind of is suggested to negotiate this explore-exploit trade-off in a really integrated first principles way. Back to the journal club and participating in Active Lab. There are epistemic and pragmatic value in participating in Active Lab. You will learn things and you will be on the path to pragmatic value. Now, if that's not the kind of pragmatic value you want to pursue, if getting into a graduate school program or trying to develop this skill to potentially apply this in future industries where active inference is used much more widely than it is today, if that's not your cup of tea for pragmatic value, that's fine. Epistemic value is still there. If this isn't the kind of information that sounds exciting and motivating to you, that's also fine. But more and more people who are seeing the epistemic and pragmatic value are beginning to participate seriously. And then we will be able to foster, when the bandwidth goes beyond just the few people who it is, more opportunities for engagement. And so that will be like a snowball rolling downhill when we're improving our niche and increasing the ease of onboarding for new participants, reaching out to specific backgrounds and language communities, because we're going to have the ability to translate accurately and to connect computer languages, various human languages, and different kinds of artifacts that we're creating. So there will be some amazing ongoing participation opportunities, and you just got to get in the game if you want to be exploring what's going to happen. That's kind of like, that's Active as a framework. Act, infer, serve is our motto, because we can't just wait on the sideline inferring until we've like thought out the perfect strategy. It's like the chess game is continuing. We act and then we infer, and we can orient that towards service or however else we see that or want to frame that. But when we take the first step, we're already in the game.
I mean, me and Jennifer are both kind of math geeks, and I'm not sure if Jennifer had a comment on that, but just to mention also, like if someone like me and Jennifer, like, well, we have our own theories and coming on to active inference more to for insight onto mathematical models for our own theories, that I have my own ideas and I realize I need some sort of mathematical framework to model it, and maybe Jennifer's in the same position, and we're just looking at the models on the market right now and say, well, active inference is one of the better mathematical models on the market, and could we apply that to our own theories?
I was basically saying, like, it is kind of my model. We haven't talked about this on the show for a while, but I have a model of, I call it a quantum mind model, but it's basically a predictive framework that takes your subconscious imperatives and makes them conscious. And so you're operating under a not surprise minimization, but cognitive dissonance avoidance framework. And so that's, yeah, I guess another one of my interests would be to what extent they can be reconciled.
Just
And see
one
what
quick
you've already
note on
got.
that.
Sure, go ahead.
One quick note on that is the variational free energy and expected free energy, which are some of the formalisms used in Active. They contain two terms. One of them is a divergence minimization term with a KL divergence, and the other is an entropy term, hashtag Church of Entropy. That is what facilitates that pragmatic and epistemic value that we were talking about. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So the divergence.
I definitely, but Jennifer's, one of the main things she always talks about is the least action principle. And as said, when I first showed her this, she was like, isn't that just the reworking of the least action principle?
That is not, I was not trying to trivialize your work, doctor, if you are a doctor, which I'm sure you are. It was in reference to the name of it, the free energy principle. I was asking if free energy principle was just a reassertion of the least action principle. It's clearly not. But it may, function on an entropic basis nevertheless.
In the paper that we discuss in 45, free energy principle made simpler, but not too simple, where Friston and Parr, two of the authors, joined and just gave amazing comments. They describe, and then we'll return to this formalism. They say they're going to rehearse how they form this Active. Say, 1, establish a particular partition of states based upon ... the sparse coupling. That's related to the internal-external Markov blanket partitioning. That's why we say it's a free energy for particular systems, not just because the ones that we're interested in, but particles. So not just open fields with no boundary condition, but the partitioning is what enables particular states. 2, unpacking the implications of the partition in terms of Bayesian inference. So providing a Bayesian statistical probabilistic reading of these partitioned states. And then 3, describing the paths of particular states with the variational principle of least action. So absolutely, it is a principle of least action applied to flows of states on the particular partition with the interpretation of variational base. So it's a common
really
Friston. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to know if there was a connection between the Bayesian priors and the quantum mechanical superposition state. Are we essentially just talking about probabilistic, like what would you expect? I guess the initial expected values. Is it saying any more than that?
In 40, live stream number 40, we discussed that, and the authors connected the quantum reference frame to the Bayesian prior. I think you'll find what you're looking for there. But yes, quantum Bayesianism, cubism, QB, ISM, I believe the connection was made even outside of Active between reference frame, updating, and aligning. And so also just one point of context is like the .0 videos. Like here, we're watching a .0 video with one of our awesome colleagues, Blue Knight. So the .0, we go through the paper with pretty small team, pretty much focusing on the argument and the context and the background of the paper. So the .0s are designed to be supplements or alternatives to reading the paper. But we go through every figure, every formalism of the paper in the order. That's what opens up the .1 and the .2 for having broader discussion around the paper. We have to return to the attracting set of the paper and the figures, and we have those up, and we try to have the authors on. But the dot 1 and the dot 2 can be more expansive and speculative and open-ended, because the dot 0, we're taking a relatively clear approach to just walking through the paper. Okay, so we mentioned how actually, yes, conditioned upon the partition and a Bayesian interpretation of the partition, it is indeed a principle of least action. And a common Friston saying or adjective is to say something is deflationary, which is kind of like not making things out to be more than they are. So Active did not invent many of these attributes, nor did it even combine many of these attributes for the first time. Like, there have been other Bayesian approaches to action selection. There's other hierarchical Bayesian models of predictive coding and action. It might be new to a given person, in which case it's so novel that it's really hard to tell what is being introduced by Active and FEP and what is just new to them. But for example, using free energy as an evidence lower bound on surprisal and seeing surprisal as self-information is not even unique or new to Active. So that's another reason why it's important for us to develop the ontology further, so we can clarify what are the claims that are made that support Active and enable it, and then what are the unique claims that differentiate active inference, importantly, from other frameworks. Like, as I mentioned, it's absolutely essential that in Active, the imperative for decision-making consists of an epistemic and a pragmatic value, unlike reinforcement or reward learning, which is driven only by a pragmatic value. And there's several other important things that are relevant, like the partition. But in this representation, the from the right side, the second and the third term from the right, well, there's many ways to partition it, and I won't go into any equation, but suffice to say that in various of the technical papers, we go through every single equation and every term. Not that they're the end of it, but again, that's our starting point for coherent shared understanding, is making the formalisms accessible for people from all backgrounds, and then starting the discussion there when we've already committed as a group, as a lab, to do that work to increase the accessibility, decrease the research debt. That's where some of the most amazing discussions happen.
Jennifer?
Great chat. I know this is 30 minutes after you said you had 30 minutes left, so I do want to be respectful of your time, because I'm hoping to continue these conversations once I've had a chance to figure out the best way that I can contribute, which I still haven't really figured out yet. Like, I know it's on the level of correcting someone's mistakes, but I've noticed that not everyone wants their mistakes corrected necessarily.
Well, here's an amazing opportunity to correct mistakes: editing and curating transcripts. It's grammatical mistakes, but it's a huge leverage point to increase the accessibility of the material, like, for example, on the quantum discussions. So you can be working on multiple levels, divergence minimizing, by first making sure that there are no errors in the text, and then annotating and saying this claim is incorrect. And
That may not be her
It's
skill set.
it's never even going to sound like that, Daniel, because language doesn't access the types of truth we're looking to get at with models of consciousness. So it's really just degrees of wrongness, your wrongness tolerance, where you want to be wrong versus where you want to be right. And I'm kind of working just based on my own personal, like, self-improvement stuff right now, is to try to make this point quickly, that there's this trade-off on a very fundamental signal processing level between precision and scope. So
And
I
one of
think I
Jennifer's
could,
probably best skills is as a meme diagram maker, that I'm more the research person who's likely to read these papers and or even you write up some sort of article or even proofread it. Jennifer probably, I mean, not sure, to put her best skill, but one of her best skills is definitely at making diagrams.
I was a professional typist for 10 years, so I'd be happy to sit in on your sessions and like transcribe them. But I don't know if that would actually be of any use.
It's of unreal use because in the positive sense, because again, this is how we leverage the consequences of conversations so that they can actually build stigmergically upon our epistemic niche and be translated into different languages. People can make diagrams from them. There's so many ways to contribute, like during and after. And so this is the Active Inference Journal project that we have at the lab. So everyone is welcome to do these kinds of practices and engage with us. But filling out the form is the on-ramp to learning about all the affordances that are enabled. And like really the one note on the Markov blanket. A Fristonism, one innovation of Friston and colleagues, was to actually separate that blanket. Again, that's the set of nodes in the Bayes graph that make two other sets of states conditionally independent. Friston partitioned that into incoming statistical dependencies with the interpretation of sense data and outgoing statistical dependencies with the interpretation of the consequences of action, active states. The live streams are our communication to the niche, but it's actually just our externalization. It's just our actions, our internal states, our lab participants, and the projects that we develop inside are externalized in a different way. So if people see the external states, that is quite literally there to allow people on their own time to digest the material and then prepare them to join and participate, or just take what they're learning and find value in it and just carry it in their own life.
Real quick, we have someone we stream with. He was in the chat earlier. If he's still there, memes, calls himself Memes of Destruction, and he's a big Stephen Wolfram fan. I have Wolfram's books behind me, and I see Wolfram quoted in some of the papers relatively often. I'm not sure if there's a crossover in his work or if it's just that they use his software in, or if or is Wolfram participated, or is there any crossover just because Memes of Destruction is always in his chat and quoting Wolfram?
The software that the earliest active inference simulations were written in was MATLAB, because Carl Friston and his neuroimaging group at UCL developed the SPM package, which is explicitly for neuroimaging, which is to a large extent why Friston is the most cited living neuroscientist, because of the massive number of neuroimaging papers and methods papers. More recently, there have been implementations of ActInf in Python and Julia. I don't know if anyone has done too much in Mathematica, but it's super tantalizing, and as far as I know, an open area to connect the simple rules, complex outcomes of Wolfram and all of that new kind of science with what we're discussing here with ActInf. There's so many low-hanging fruit and medium-hanging fruit and high-hanging fruit that people can just show up and start to learn more about this tree and how it's growing, and they'll see more affordances as they get involved. Again, one cannot wait on the sidelines and infer until they strike with the perfect one action. The best first action is just to get involved with participating, in my perspective.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's why interdisciplinary studies, or benefiting and if these, so to say, these are true or revealing truths, that they'll explain things and connect partial truths together, or kind of my multiple truth hypothesis, where you have what is truth. And maybe I mentioned, because for my multiple truth hypothesis, which was kind of a framework I developed at Interfaith, but I wanted to forward as even to mathematical logic theory, and maybe even these equations, and what I call it was somewhat based on chess algorithms and for evaluating chess positions, but are called the truth evaluation functions, which are computer algorithms that there's been some sense for directions, like, but say mostly for like gaming and evaluating chess positions, but also for determining the truth of statements based on internet searches. and there's certain algorithms that are designed to give a numeric estimate of a truth value. They're called truth discovery functions. And so I was trying to set up as a thought experiment, what if you use one of these computer algorithms to truth discovery function to solve the meaning of life, or to estimate all truths. And that was kind of how I came onto the active inference, I guess, for my multiple truth hypothesis, where you would be looking at a whole bunch of theories and axioms that have explanatory power, and that could possibly, through some sort of function, be given a truth value between 0 and 1. And then of all the possible hypotheses and theorems, you would have values that would be constantly changing based on feedback mechanisms of new information. So whether there's one single truth that could explain everything, or you're going to have a whole list of partial truths that have a value somewhere between 0 and 1, and for certain aspects might approach 1, but the same theory in explaining other things might approach 0. And I'm not sure if it's making any sense what I'm saying, but I was thinking of some sort of equations like the free energy principle, but if it would be a thought experiment applied to, say, what if you created an algorithm, an equation with a feedback mechanism to solve the quest for truth? What would that look like?
I'll give some last thoughts here, and then I think we can totally pick up for another time. So that's very consistent, even the bounding with 0 to 1 with Bayesian statistics. And I think this is like what it would look like to move from a frequentist science operating environment to a Bayesian scientific operating environment, instead of the papers published based upon 0.05 p-value, reject or accept or fail to reject the null hypothesis, and then the headline comes out with the binary logic. This is good for you, or this is not good for you. And then people try to tally up the number of nots versus the number of yes, and then they met in a review paper, and then there's another p-value. The Bayesian way of doing this would be like scientific contributions add new data set and analyses to a growing corpus of information that constitutes our prior. And then the prior is updated as new information comes in. And so it allows clarity around how priors are being defined, what data is being integrated into the algorithm, and what the posterior probability is of different hypotheses. So it's like absolutely a Bayes compatible way of working. And then also a final comment is, I was very lucky in graduate school to have some classes with Professor Helen Longino, who studied for many years different kinds of scientific pluralism. And so that's a very important avenue for people to explore. And there's multiple kinds of pluralism. And science is not as absolutist as some believe. It's not as monist or hegemonic as it can seem sometimes. There's so much pluralism in science, and that's not to say that we just blur all boundaries and nothing can be differentiated from anything, but actually the particular partition in the multi-perspectival world that it enacts, where there's different cognitive entities that are engaging in their own Bayesian update processes, is a form of cognitive pluralism. And again, there's more to say, but pluralism is a super important avenue. And I think what you're describing is definitely consistent with a Bayesian approach to scientific reporting, actually. So I hope that we can continue the discussion, and I'm always down to rejoin. And I hope people go to activeinference.org, and if they're interested, to participate.
Yeah, we appreciate you giving us so much time. And let me just final question, because I've been following your content and watching it. And so someone does decide that they want to participate. And, if you just have a schedule of speakers, there's just say okay, I'm going to look at your schedule over the next few months and find the paper that is most related to the topics I'm interested in, or maybe have something to add? Or is it just kind of like I did? I just, joined your Discord and joined your very next, program, even though it didn't necessarily have anything specific with my research. I just tried to read and hop on with the very next topic. So like, how does someone do that? Do they just get involved and then try to join one of the upcoming panels? Or are they supposed to select from the coming speakers and papers that would be more relevant to their areas of interest and expertise?
Yes. So again, the live streams of any kind, the presentation guest streams or the paper discussion live streams, are really only a small part of what the lab does. Most participation affordances and what most participants do most of the time is not live streams. You're a live streamer, so it was a natural affordance, but there's many, many contributions that are around other projects. For those who do want to participate in live streams, and they indicate that when they join or when we have conversations, then we will absolutely share with the calendar of upcoming scheduled sessions and figure out what the best place for them to join is.
Okay, great. Yeah, really appreciate. Do you have your own YouTube page also? I have linked, or do you? Is it just Active Inference?
So even before Active, I do have my own YouTube. It's different. The two kinds of videos that I've done on my own YouTube are silent drawing videos. So it's just like a camera facing down while I'm doing drawing, silent, and some videos around 16 so far on synergetics, which is Bucky Fuller's contribution, vectorial geometry, and a few other related areas. So those are the kinds of videos that I do on my own personal channel, but I'd
I just
encourage
got this
anyone
book
to.
recently since you mentioned it.
Oh, I love that. Nine Chains to the Moon.
So
Let's just
not
get on each
necessarily
other's shoulders.
related to your own personal interest.
Yes, we'll be at the moon 9 times over if we just stood on each other's shoulders like a Dr. Seuss book. Like, amazing thought. But yeah, I love Bucky Fuller and a lot of other areas outside of Active too. So if people are curious, they can check it out. But Active Lab is the institutional tier way to participate. But of course, anyone can contact me through whatever channel if they want to discuss anything else.
Okay, I shared your webpage, and maybe I'll look up your YouTube. I'll add that also. I really appreciate you speaking to us for so long. I'm definitely looking forward to the Grossberg lecture, and then I guess you're taking July off for Active.
There'll be, yeah, right. No live streams for July. We'll continue
I'll look
to
at your
meet for
schedule of
projects.
events and hope to participate more. So have a great weekend, and really appreciate it, and look towards collaborating more in the future.
Epic. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jen. Goodbye.
Bye.
Okay, yeah. I guess I still got Jennifer here. If you wanted to say anything, we kept Daniel over 2 hours. Appreciate him giving so much time, and I've been sharing Active Inference on Week in Review for a few months now. So thank God it was relatively smooth, where I just joined their Discord and spoke to them and participated and got Daniel on my channel for an interview. So I'm glad that went so smooth, and the regular viewers that are interested in consciousness or the research, and I think specifically Jennifer, if she's interested in participating in this. Looks like you've got a screen share.
Yeah, if I can help, I definitely want to. Yeah, so this is my little mini proof here. It's not fully finished, but that was just one little thing I wanted to mention, was that defining the scope of what it is you're trying to say is the most important thing, and I am going to have a hard time committing without being able to sort of truncate the domain. Because,
people like being their own boss. So like when you're in someone else's, you got to follow their rules. So the advantages of collaboration, and you could be kind of friendly or maybe speak with them. But yeah, if you're going to join the lab or not, that's up to you. But I mean, certainly the equations or their research is probably useful to what we're talking about, as I've been bringing them up for months now.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand if they want to model consciousness for to facilitate personal understanding, or to implement it as, I guess, what they call like biomimicking technology. Like, I'm not even clear on that level.
He kind of avoided the consciousness question in totality, and that's, I've hinted at whether it's eliminativist in nature, but I mean, it's descriptive of processes, and whether saying cognition and perception, which in my part is part of consciousness, but depending on how you define consciousness, it's not necessarily part of consciousness studies. That many people include perception and cognition as part of consciousness, but that we definitely do. But I think for various reasons they wanted to skirt that issue. Although
Yeah, I'm just saying,
Daniel himself may have his own personal interest that is more wide than the professional, or so to say the lab of active inference.
mhm, I have more studying to do before I can really comment more. But I do have some notes, and what he said was encouraging. So, are you thinking you don't want to tell them about your multiple truth hypothesis, like that can somehow work with this?
Well, I mentioned it briefly. I mean, I don't know if he'd invite me on as a guest or something, and if have a paper, if I had have like what I wrote on the multiple truth hypothesis probably wasn't sufficient. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you wanted to have me on as a guest, I would probably do that, and if that was a good way to put out my ideas in a field of experts that might find people who would cooperate. So definitely on this stream, I mentioned it a few times, and I think he shared what I said about the end of the truth discovery function, that the free energy principle uh, Bayesian framework could be used for what I'm talking about, and that's why I mentioned one of the pillars of the multiple truth hypothesis is this truth discovery function, which would be a form of Bayesian analysis. And so I think he intuitively understood that. And so to some extent, um, I might be able to change that, and I could maybe even put free energy principle or active inference as the pillar of the multiple truth hypothesis instead of what I've been calling the truth discovery function. So I'd have to look more into that. And but yeah, I think that like I told him, that I came on to active inference for my own purposes, more in search of a mathematical framework to formulate the multiple truth hypothesis. And the formulas that were up earlier um, are probably of the free energy principle are probably very close to what the truth discovery function of a multiple truth hypothesis formulation would look like. But I don't know if I'd have to actually write a paper on that, to
Well, you're a
be a
little bit
guest.
limited in the sense that you only have an epistemological and a utilitarian discovery, whereas it would appear that the discovery would be, infinite number of possible motives. That, yeah. So it's
Well, and that's why I came on to active inference, was largely in search. I mean, one thing because it's consciousness studies, and it's part of the predictive mind, and one of the top theories on the market. And it's just a good YouTube channel because they had expert interviews with PowerPoints. So I've been following it, but like I do think that I could adapt these equations for my multiple truth hypothesis. How long
well,
that'll
your
take me?
MTH has infinity axioms. So the question is going from the infinity axioms to a finite, an open system, but a finite system, which is what an equation like what we had up earlier would be referring to.
Yes, I think there's promise in that. How much he understood of that, I'm not sure. We'll see in the future. Um, so like I've been watching through all their content. I'm almost caught up. Uh, I'm on like lecture 35, and they're in the 40s now. So, almost be caught up and watched all their content. I'm not sure how often, I'll participate in their panels or their papers, or if they'll have me as a guest. But as a content, like Week in Review, just reviewing content out there. There's the Science of Consciousness conference. There's Models of Consciousness. Carl Friston, I don't think has participated in the Science of Consciousness conference, but he's participated with some of the people that have, like Christopher Koch, and is one of the biggest names. That's what he said, because of his modeling software for neural imaging, is one of the single most quoted people in scientific papers, period. So, certainly that's why I've been covering it, and I'll continue to cover it. And as someone researching the field, I recommend Active Inference Lab. What does it mean to participate, or what the benefit to any of the viewers, and how much homework do people like doing in terms of, reading scientific papers and then talking about it. That if that's not Jennifer's, type thing that she would be interested in doing, in reading a scientific paper and then participating in a group discussion on it. I might do that. That's, it said, because I've been pushing Jennifer to publish a paper, and maybe even me and Jennifer would publish a paper together. My blog, just to show this real quick, on Lichess, it really blew up. My Ahimsa principle. It has
I'm so happy to hear that. How many views did it get?
It has 4,768 views and 160 likes. So that's the Cognitive Dissonance has 600
It went
views.
viral.
Yeah, and the Kotov one has over 600 views. And if you look on community blogs on the chess server, currently I am the top blog post on the whole chess server, with and it's off topic, and I had a lot of positive feedback. I even have tens of messages, and I got some Indians, people saying they're so glad that the Vedic Hindu philosophy is being spread and known. 160 likes. So ironically, I had real positive feedback on the chess server from that, and definitely I've had a few incentive to write more, but so that's I think my 9th blog post. It's the 7th I put on the chess server, because the first 2 on the multiple truth hypothesis and the hero's journey and music I didn't put on the chess server. But I think that keep on publishing blogs. If I could almost have something up to like a publishable paper, or whether I go down that venue or not, but certainly to get feedback, have thousands of people reading it is
published where? Like 4,000 views. Like, who even gets that many?
Well, I mean, even some published papers don't get 4,000 views, but I mean, if it in a journal or something, I don't know where. I mean, the Ahimsa principle. There's probably some journal, and whether.
Well, if you're getting 4,000 views, you should become the journal. Just flip the script.
Well, that one's embedded on the chess server. Like, they're not coming to my own page. Like, that's within the chess server, and it's also based on me being I guess a prominent chess player on the server, that people are reading that in connection to the Duvid that they come across playing chess all the time. But I could submit a paper to a journal. That would be the way of doing it. I'm saying that maybe even one of my blog posts already, say you could request, I forget like SSN number or something like that, but you could request a number and have it registered, and then submit it to journals. And that's all it means to be published. So even in terms, like, it's possible that I could register one of my blog posts and submit it to a journal, and if one of them accepted it, then I would be a published author. So I mean, it's not like being published is like such some extensive barrier that can't be met. But it's a certain barrier that is like a published author. That's what it means to be published. To be a popular author isn't the same as being a published author. In terms of like scientific credibility, there's more to being accepted by an accredited journal. But yeah, so that's good feedback. And like I mentioned, maybe if me and Jennifer did write, the first one would be on the quantum periodic table. I have to go back to researching the periodic table, and then maybe Jennifer had some holdups on exactly how to frame or what the quantum periodic table gives in terms of
Like
the value.
arguing that it's the best presentation of the periodic table because it frames some like minimalist ontology kind of thing.
Well, it doesn't have to be the best, but in terms of the periodic trends that I mean, the holdup from I think your end was to either to how to read the periodic trends that are read into the normal table, and if those periodic trends can be read into your table, how to do that, and if they can't be, what periodic trends can be read into it. And I thought, like, at least from my perspective, I thought that was to have a value proposition of being useful as a table that people would look at it and be able to pull out periodic trends like they can in the regular table. So I think that's the last point where me and Jennifer were talking and didn't get any further, and so no progress has been made since then. And but maybe
yeah, I mean, I can tell you why. Like my version and the 2D version are opposites in a sense. Like it's not that 2 is the opposite of 3, but my version is the entangled version, and if it's on a flat surface, it's not really entangled too much. So whatever's on the 2D one is probably not going to be on the 3D one. So that it's like I'd have to argue for the 3D one for, that it's an ontology.
It was the same problem we've had going back many times, like what does it do and how does it work?
What it is, yeah.
So it's just like, what does it do and how does it work? And in terms of what does it do, you were saying would be visualizing periodic trends, and how does it work?
Well,
how do you read it?
It doesn't do that really. It doesn't really help to visualize periodic trends because the 2D one helps to visualize periodic trends. So if the 2D one does that, the 3D one probably doesn't do that. Like its value is as a singular entity. So it's derives, I guess, like a 4-dimensional ontology versus a 1-dimensional ontology, which I would have to argue is the default.
We don't have to get too sidetracked on that, but I was saying that in order to turn it into a paper, that it would have to be able to clearly define something like that in terms of what does it do and how does it work. But like if that, but we're moving towards writing or publishing, or even in terms of like a book report on active inference. Maybe I'll write a post about active inference, or just blogging if to get good at writing. Could do like a monthly recap on active inference and who they're speaking
that would
to
be helpful.
In the advancements. And so like week in review, if we don't have enough to even a week in review, like a monthly recap of week in review to but if that may not be enough there as opposed to active inference or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot to do, so it's good to find collaboration, saying like on expertise, people who have been studying the field, who are making advancements in the field, and to collaborate and understand the current state of knowledge for publication, the historical analysis. What is the current state of knowledge, and how are you advancing it? So when you're at the threshold of being publishable, of expanding the threshold of the current state of knowledge, usually a sign of that is you have peers of the other people who are at the forefront. So this is the current state of knowledge, and here's me talking with the other people who are at the forefront of the current state of knowledge, and here's how I have expanded that, so to say that's how paper in the scientific community is structured. And like the engineering conferences that I show, that scientific conferences are also like that. So the Science of Consciousness conference is Penrose Hamerov, and as I said, Friston, who's also is a member of the Royal Society of London, I think over 15 years now, and I would say Friston is the head of the other competitive branch of models of consciousness. So of that field, you're like, who's on the forefront of consciousness studies? There's Stuart Hameroff and the Science of Consciousness conference, and then there's Friston and the Models of Consciousness conference. So that now we've expanded to both networks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. This is wonderful progress, and I look forward to the next one.
Okay, great. So we'll see everybody Sunday Week in Review. Thanks to Daniel for hopping on, and follow the Active Inference. I'm going to put that link in the chat. Stephen Grossberg, just show real quick. I didn't even finish the book. It's pretty dense, but I read on my paper, one of my public study sessions, Grossberg and the Resonant Mind, and here's his new textbook for like a neurology textbook, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. Stephen Grossberg is going to be their guest on, I think it's Monday, so definitely check that out, and I'll plan on being in the chat. And I would say Friston's probably, I said he's one of the most quoted of all scientific papers, period, because of neuroimaging. But Grossberg and the resonant mind is resonant brain is also one of the mainstream models of consciousness. Like Penrose Hameroff hypothesis. But even that, the quantum consciousness is not a complete model of consciousness. It's just an explanation of one mechanism and information theory. Grossberg resonant brain is definitely up there in one of the bigger theories. So check that out. So see everybody Sunday Week in Review. Thanks for joining, and have a great weekend.
Bye for now.